So today we are joined by Dr. Joao Pedro Magalhaes and Dr. Sara Zella. Dr. Sara is from the research is a research fellow at the Oxford Institute of Population Aging, and she looks at the impact of different work and other life courses on women's well-being and quality of their life in early retirement and welfare regimes, and how that actually interacts, those things interact with their quality of life. And our guest today is Dr. Joao Pedro Magalhaes, who is at Liverpool studying aging and especially the comparative aging of different organisms. But we will talk about that and many other things during the show, and how actually the current situation that is going on with the viral infection, COVID-19, can actually have bearing with aging, biological aging, and chronological aging as well. So thank you both, Sara and Joao, joining us to this talk.
Thank you.
Joao, I have always admired your work. I mean, we met, I think, more than 10 years ago when I invited you to come and give a talk at the Oxford University Scientific Society. And you have especially focused on comparing aging in humans and in other animals. And one of your main themes that you try to promote through your various databases and your work is that aging is plastic. What does that concept actually mean?
So the idea for comparative biology, or the core concept, is that different animals age at different paces. So anyone who has pets knows that, if you have a hamster, it will probably not live longer than a couple of years. If you have a cat, it may live 20 years, or in some cases more than that. Dogs would normally be a little less than that, but even within dogs there will be variation. And on the other hand of the spectrum, you have species that can live a very, very long time. Like some species of parrots can live decades and decades. So the point is that different species will age at different rates. Not only will have different lifespans, but they will age at different rates. If you then go at the molecular, biochemical level and look into the tissues of an old 2-year-old hamster, you will see that it's quite aged. There are changes that resemble what you see in an 8-year-old human being. So the point is that species that are physiologically and biologically similar, like mammals, they age at quite rapid different paces. And if we can understand that they can tell us how we can extend human lifespan as well. And the basis for the species differences in aging is very poorly understood. We don't know why that happens, but it has to have a genetic basis. So no matter how well you take care of your hamster, it will most likely live about 2 years. It may live a little longer, but it's not going to live 20 years like a cat can do. It certainly is not going to live 100 years, no matter how well you take care of your hamster. So there's going to have genetic factors that are intrinsic to the biology of a hamster that make it age faster than other species like cats, dogs, or humans. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand the genetic, the molecular, the cellular, the biochemical basis of those underlying differences between species to try to better understand the basic biology of aging, and ultimately why humans live as long as we do, and how we can further extend human lifespan and preserve health.
This might sound like I'm jumping or cutting to the chase, but so turtles live a very long time, like the Galapagos turtles. And blue whales, they seem to not get cancer. Professor Pito here, a paradox is named after here, Richard Pito's paradox. So what have you learned over the decades of your research, from Harvard all the way to Liverpool, that what is this plasticity? Where does it come from? Is it purely in the genes, or are there other factors as well?
So that's the big question. I mean, there's quite a lot to it. I guess there is an evolutionary perspective of why different species age at different rates. I mean, you mentioned the Galapagos tortoises, so there's ecological evolutionary factors. The fact is the Galapagos tortoises don't have natural predators, which means that they don't have so much pressure to grow and to reproduce early in life as compared to similar species, or they're closely related species in the continent in South America. So what you see in the Galapagos tortoises compared to other island populations is that they can grow very big because they don't have natural predators. They can take much longer to start reproducing. They can reproduce slower, and they can also extend their lifespans. They can evolve a greater longevity. So species have to be understood in their evolutionary ecological context. If you think about other species like whales, well, they have very few natural predators. The blue whale, I think young can be predated by killer whales, but that's about it. They don't have other natural predators. Certainly an adult blue whale does not have natural predators. Same for bowhead whales, as far as I know. The longest lived whales that have been estimated to live over 200 years is one of the species we've studied. So if the species have no natural predators, at least as adults, then again, they can evolve very long lifespans. So there's an evolutionary basis to it that's important to understand as well. But ultimately, that doesn't tell us at the mechanistic level why the species live longer than others. So from a mechanistic perspective, we're talking about molecular cellular mechanisms, which in turn are encoded in the genome. So there has to be a genetic component to it. There has to be a coding. It has to be encoded in the genome. And of course, that will then be reflected in molecular, cellular, physiological, biochemical processes. Now, we still don't understand very well why this happens. I guess our studies of genomes of long-lived species, they point towards particular proteins that we can consider candidates. That quite a few of them are related to DNA damage responses. So one of my hypotheses is that long-lived species deal with DNA damage in a more efficient way than short-lived species. Because if you're a short-lived mouse or rat or hamster, the priority is to grow quickly, reach sexual maturity, and reproduce, because you're not going to live very long in the wild. So if there's some DNA damage to your cells, probably not that important. What matters is that we continue growing, continue developing to reach sexual maturity. That's what matters. On the other hand, humans or whales or mole rats are quite different. If there's some DNA damage, well, let's hold on for a second. Let's fix that damage in the cell. If there's too much damage, let's kill the cell, because we don't want cells with DNA damage in us, because we expect to live a very long time. And we don't want those cells to become cancer or become detrimental. So I think we've known for decades that there are differences in the way cell cycle regulation operates in human cells and in mouse cells. So we've known that. And now we're discovering also differences between, for example, cells from mole rats respond to DNA damage compared to other short-lived rodents like mice. Now, that's one hypothesis. We don't know for sure if at a whole organism level that's happening. Again, in whales, we see changes in proteins involved in DNA damage responses and cell cycle regulation specific to long-lived whales, like the bowhead whale. But the problem, of course, you can't go and get a bowhead whale and switch off a gene and see what happens to its lifespan. Obviously that's not feasible. So we don't know for sure. But what we do know is at the genetic, molecular, even cellular level, what we're seeing is this optimization of responses to DNA damage. I'm not even sure optimization is the best word, because everything has to be understood on an evolutionary context. And if mice have less stringent threshold for detecting DNA damage, is because they have to optimize reproduction. So their mechanisms are optimized for their life history strategies. But they're not optimized for longevity. So what we think is that species that optimize DNA damage responses for longevity will figure out molecular mechanisms to cope and to minimize genomic damage and to maintain genomic integrity. So that's what we see overall, the overall picture that's emerging from comparative genomics and for some of the cellular studies that my lab and others have done.
I should say that I'm not expert on biology and I don't know too much about cellulars and genetics, but it happened to me to attend a very interesting seminars last year. It was a zoology department, and there they organized a meeting between different scholars who are working with animals and aging. So it was a very interesting opportunity to understand a little more about the aging of butterfly compared with the elephants and all the other species. It was really wonderful. And among the others, there was a professor who you probably know. He's a Professor Cox from the Department of Biochemistry here in Oxford. And what she's studying is aging and cell senescence. And for me, it was very interesting to understand her work, because what if I understood correctly, she's trying to understand is how to slow down aging, looking in particular on the cells and genetics inside cells. Do you have some comments on it, or?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So we've done some work on cell senescence as well. In fact, we published a paper just a couple of days ago on this. So what seems to happen? So taking a step back first. So we've known for quite a long time, for decades now, that human cells have a limited proliferative ability in vitro. That is, you can take out cells from an individual, from yourself. Actually, you can take a skin biopsy and you can then culture those cells in the lab. That is, you allow them to proliferate, you allow them to divide, and they can divide for, depending on cell type and tissue, etc., but they can divide for quite some time, normally for several months. But eventually they stop proliferating. And that's when it's said that the cells become senescent. So the cells reach their end of their lifespan. So we've known that for quite some time, that there is a limit to the proliferative ability of human cells. And that's called cellular senescence. And so it's been long argued for decades that, well, if our cells have a limited proliferative ability, then perhaps that's one of the reasons we age. Our cells just stop proliferating in organisms. And there's been loads of research for decades on that now. And there seems to be an accumulation of senescent cells in some tissues, certainly in mice, and at least some tissues in humans, although it's quite difficult to quantify senescent cells in organisms, in particularly in human beings. In mice, you can sometimes create genetically modified mice that will tell you if the cells are senescent or not. But in humans, it's quite difficult to quantify cell senescence. But they do seem to accumulate, at least in some tissues. And the hypothesis is that they become detrimental in old age. For example, they contribute to tissue dysfunction, they contribute to loss of homeostasis, they contribute to inflammation as well. So that's the hypothesis. Having said that, we don't know for sure, certainly for humans, whether cell senescence is a contributing factor to aging or not. What I would say, also going back to the comparative biology perspective, is that it's quite interesting that so cellular senescence in humans is primarily driven by telomere shortening. So telomeres are these ends of chromosomes that, with each cell division, they shorten. Okay, so if you genetically engineer cells to have long telomeres, they just proliferate uncontrollably. So they keep proliferating, they do not become senescent. And we know that, for example, cancer cells, that they have to overcome telomere shortening in order for you to have a cancer. So cellular senescence seems to be an anti-tumor mechanism. That's the reason why we have telomere shortening. So it's quite interesting that when you start looking at species of different lifespans, actually what you see is that species that have long lifespans, like humans, like whales, like elephants, big animals with long lifespans, we tend to have short telomeres, while short-lived small animals like mice, hamsters, rats, and so on, they tend to have longer telomeres. And the explanation for that is that telomere shortening and senescence are anti-tumor mechanisms, and it's so that's, I think, very well established now. The question now is, okay, so what is the role of cell senescence in aging? And that's where there's still a lot of question marks. So I've actually published a paper just a few days ago in genome biology, where we did various analyses of cell senescence networks, but we also looked at signatures of cellular senescence in human tissues. This is just using gene expression markers. And again, we found some evidence of cellular senescence in some tissues, or markers of cellular senescence. Let me rephrase that. We found evidence of genetic markers of cellular senescence in some human age tissues, but not in others. So overall, again, that fits the picture that yes, cellular senescence occurs in some human tissues, but not in all of them. But it doesn't answer the big question, which is, okay, so even if you have senescent cells accumulating in some human tissues, does it matter? Is that because a lot of changes that occur with age that are not important for aging? I'm getting lots of gray hairs, but that's not what drives the process of aging. That's just a consequence. That's just a sign of aging, but it's not a cause of aging. So about senescent cells, we still don't understand that. We still don't know whether senescent cells are causal in aging or not. There's some evidence from mice that they can contribute to tissue degeneration of some tissues, but in humans, we still don't know. So those are still big questions.
Thank you. Those are quite succinct answers. I want to, again, it might sound like that I'm cutting to the chase, but the question is that the proof is generally in the pudding. So we talked about mice having, because they live they may live short life because they reproduce so much or so quickly, so there's a cause and then there's the consequence. Your gray hair analogy was very good, but is it true in your comparative analysis that longer-lived animals like bowhead whales, like blue whales, like the Galapagos turtle, like the Asian elephants, or elephants in general, when they live longer lives, do they also have compressed morbidity, or in the sense that they have good health for a longer period of time as well?
So they said, I think that would depend a little bit on how you measure it. So surely if you have a longer lifespan, you're going to have a longer period with good health. But then the question is, okay, do you also have a longer period with bad health? I think in terms of wild animals, that's a very hard thing to say. I mean, when you think about elephants or bowhead whales, the fact is we don't know for sure how long they live in the wild. We can estimate it. We think that they live a very long time, but we don't know for sure. We certainly don't know what kind of pathologies they have. I mean, one of the questions I'm asked quite a lot is, what do whales die of? They live so long, but what do they die of? And the answer is, we don't know. Particularly whales, because, when they die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean normally. So you can't even analyze it. So we don't know what's the pathologies that these animals are suffering when they're old. So we don't have an answer to your question from wild animals. Bowhead whales and elephants, they seem to be fairly resistant to cancer given their lifespan, actually. So from that perspective, they do have better health. There's a fascinating paper from Joshua Schiffman in Utah on elephants and their cancer resistance, for example. So they seem to be very cancer resistant. They do have cancer, but it seems to be lower incidence than human beings, for instance, and certainly much lower incidence than mice. So that's an indication that they have good health, but we don't know in the wild. Now, what we know about manipulations of aging in animal models, in particular mice, is that some, not all, but some genetic manipulations and dietary manipulations of aging in animals extend not just lifespan and also health span. So you are not just prolonging longevity, you are prolonging the period the animals live in good health. And this can be achieved by genetic engineering, and it can be achieved by certain dietary manipulations like caloric restriction. So that's what we know in animal models in the lab. Regarding wild animals, unfortunately, we don't know.
Right. Okay. Okay. So this comparative genomics and comparative biology that you look at, and I completely understand that we don't know how they die, but we certainly know that they live long. And all of the mechanisms that you have talked about that we are learning about, for example, the DNA damage response that you talked about, has that been then tried on experimental animal models in lab? And ultimately, the goal obviously is to improve both quantity and quality of human life. So in putting that in context, are people trying the things that you're learning, the concepts that you're learning in this comparative biology in animal models?
I would say some things are being tried. So, for example, the idea that DNA damage is important in aging is not is not new. So we certainly have a lot of data from animal models, a lot of research on testing that specific hypothesis. So people going into mice, and disrupting DNA damage responses. And mice frequently, if you do that, they either develop a lot of cancer and or develop a lot of aging phenotypes early in life. In other words, they appear to age faster. So that's been tested. So those are hypotheses that being tested. But there's a lot of things that are not that simple to do. So, for example, optimizing DNA damage response is something that's quite tricky to do because DNA damage responses are quite complex. So if you start playing with them, you see, well, sometimes they become harmful actually. So I mean, that's just to give an example. So generally speaking, I would say some of the things are being tested, but not all of it.
I have a question which is very linked to what Avi just asked you, and it's regarding, in my opinion, one of the biggest questions that there is nowadays in aging, which is the importance of living longer, but also maybe it's a big importance to live healthier, so to become old and at the same time to be still healthy when we are old. So my question is, what do you think we can do to be healthier in old age? We know that genetic is very important, but regarding, for example, lifestyle, there is a lot of research on also eating the right food, doing sport, exercise, and all the other, quit smoking, and all the other lifestyles. Do you think there is in some way the best answer to this question for now?
Well, I guess nowadays, you cannot do genetic manipulations like you can in humans, like you can in animal models. So what in terms of humans? So there's a lot of ways we can extend lifespan and health span in animal models. I mean, one of the things my lab maintains is we maintain various databases of genes and drugs that extend lifespan in animal models. And we have over 2,000 genes. We have hundreds of drugs that extend lifespan in animal models. So there's a lot that we know about of how to manipulate aging and longevity in animals. So that's quite well established. But of course, the big question is, will any of this work in humans? So in humans, unfortunately, we know relatively little. I mean, I still think that if you want to optimize your health in old age, you still have to follow very standard advice like don't smoke, eat healthy, maintain a healthy BMI, exercise. Just follow your mother's advice. Really, that's all you can do. So there's nothing magical coming up yet from the field. There's a lot of pharmacological approaches that could be interesting. I think there's a lot of compounds and even drugs that extend lifespan in animal models, including in mice, that may have human applications. So, for example, near Barzilai in New York, they're looking into doing a clinical trial for aging, the first clinical trial for aging using metformin. So there is now a body of evidence from animal models of things that may work in humans. But for now, we still don't know. The last thing I would say on this is that also that, okay, so we know that we know that so far, if you want to optimize your health in old age, you have to follow this well-established advice. However, what we also know is that there's a component of genetics to your longevity, which increases with age. So what it means is that environmental factors and lifestyle are the most important for your health when you're 70 or 80. But for centenarians, it's mostly down to heritability, it's mostly down to genetics. So if you want to be a healthy 70 or 80-year-old, yes, you have to follow your mother's advice. But if you want to be a centenarian, really it's about choosing your parents and grandparents and having the genes in order to live that long.
Well, some of us are not that lucky. So I know, Joao, so I've known you for a very long time, but you on your website point out that you are a musician and a stand-up comedian and many other things. And I remember that you used to also note that you were a transhumanist. So I'm going to, I know because you are a very prolific scientist, you want to stick to the facts. But in the next few questions, I actually want to look at the impact of the work that you are doing and the entire rejuvenation biotechnology community and the other geroscientists that are doing the impact of that and what we can imagine the future to be. So in that context, the work that you're finding or the comparative biology work that you are finding in other organisms, the database of drugs that you maintain that could potentially have lifespan extension effects, all of this, when ultimately applied to human, do you think that it can actually improve the quality of human life and the quantity of human life?
Well, that's the million-dollar question is, of course, what or which drugs in animal models will have benefits in humans. I mean, my intuition would be that some will, some won't. I mean, that's, how many times have we cured cancer in mice? But it doesn't mean we can do it in humans. So lots of stuff will work in animal models, including mammalian models, but not in humans. So that is the big challenge, is trying to figure out what's going to work in humans. My intuition is some things will work in humans, some won't. But that's why you then have to go into clinical trials. And that's why companies are doing clinical trials for particular drugs already, trying to slow down human aging. You have to do the tests. You can do, one of the things my lab does, and I actually do with some companies as well, is trying to prioritize targets and candidates. So you can use computational approaches to try to determine, all right, are these compounds in animal models, which of them have the greatest chance of working in human beings? So you can do this. There are data types, and quite a lot of compounds that extend lifespan in animals already are used in the clinic, although not to treat aging, but they're already used for human applications. So one of the things we've been doing also is we've been working with colleagues in London trying to see if some of the drugs that we see extend lifespan in worms, do they have any benefits in humans, in addition to the condition they're being used for. So for example, at the level of epigenetic age. So we know that epigenetic age is an indicator of how age someone is biologically. So can we use that to infer whether particular drugs in humans are actually slowing down human aging? So you can use those kind of data sets, you can use those kind of approaches to try to prioritize what we're discovering in animal models for human translation. And that's what we're doing. Having said that, at the end of the day, you still need to do those clinical trials. You still need to do those experiments. And again, my intuition is some things will work, some things will not work in humans. But I'm convinced that some of the interventions, including drugs that we're discovering in animal models, will slow down human aging. And that's why I'm very optimistic about the discovery of longevity drugs.
That's very good to hear. Do you think that when these longevity drugs or biologics or gene therapies or whatever the method of treatment it is, when it works, do you think that you will actually see a reduction in non-communicable chronic diseases, or at least a postponement of that? So heart disease, type 2 diabetes, dementia, or neurodegenerative diseases. I'm assuming that when you say that it will, so drugs are and treatments are being developed to target aging, you mean that it'll actually improve the quality of life, of course, by postponing these diseases. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That's the goal. And that's what we can do in animal models already. So we can postpone aging. So we're not, I mean, animals will still develop pathologies, they will still die, they will still degenerate, but they do so later. So that's what we're doing. So we're extending healthy lifespan of the animals. So the human equivalent would be to turn a 70-year-old into a 50-year-old. So the diseases will still occur, but they do so later in life. And we would witness a compression of morbidity as well. So it's quite interesting, for instance, when you look at centenarians, that they obviously live longer, but what is quite interesting is that the average amount of time that they spend in hospital before they die is actually much lower than for people who die in their 70s or 80s. So it's not that just they're living longer, they're living longer with good health, and they're less of economic burden on society. So if we could find a drug to turn everyone into centenarians, then that would be excellent from a health perspective, because people would be healthier for longer, from an economic perspective and from a medical perspective. And again, that's something that we and other labs are trying to figure out what are the secrets of centenarians that allow them to live longer.
So, of course, we have talked about how you study long-lived animals. You have mentioned bowhead whale, and if anybody does a search on your name, it'll come up with bowhead whale articles with your name in it in BBC as well. So why don't we just study centenarians and supercentenarians, because they're humans, of course. They should one-on-one translate. And how far along are we at studying? Sara is originally from Italy. There are these areas of Italy that are rich in centenarians. I think these are called blue zones. So how far along are we studying centenarians and supercentenarian populations along the world? And can we just replicate whatever they're doing as far as in their genomics into us normal people who do not have centenarian parenthood?
So there's been, people have been studying centenarians for quite a long time now. And in more recent years, there's been a lot of studies of genetics of centenarians. We still know very little about why centenarians live as long as they do. So that's something that I would say it's an issue in the field. So as I mentioned earlier, we actually know a lot about how to manipulate aging in animals. We know a lot about the genetics of aging in animal models, including in mice. We actually know very little about the genetics of human longevity. So there's been massive studies looking into genetics of human longevity, and there's been some genes discovered, but they've given relatively little insight into what is the secret for centenarians. There's a gene called ApoE, which tends to be discovered all the time as associated with longevity. Stands for a polypopprotein E. It's also a major risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So it's somewhat unclear whether it's a longevity or a disease gene. Because, of course, if you're a centenarian, maybe you're a centenarian because you lack disease genes, not because you have protective genes. So it's somewhat unclear whether that's the case with ApoE as well. So there's a few genes associated with longevity in centenarians, but very, very few, and they don't explain. You can actually mathematically estimate the impact of genetics and longevity of centenarians and how much we understand about the genetic basis, and it's very little. So that's a big problem we have, I think, in the field. And even when you look at things like massive projects like UK Biobank, over 500,000 individuals, you see a few genes associated with longevity. I think that there was I think the top hit, actually, other than ApoE, is a gene associated with smoking. But probably not surprising, because if people are genetically predisposed to smoking, then they're not going to live very long, right? So it makes sense that that's associated with longevity. But unfortunately, we haven't really gathered much insights into biology of aging from studies of centenarians, even though I'm optimistic that as more sequencing occurs, then we'll obtain more information. As for supercentenarians, I mean, we've done some work in collaboration with a company in the US on this as well. And I can't go into all the details, but I'd say the problem with supercentenarians is that there's relatively few of them in the world. So unless they have, one gene in common, which I don't think is going to happen, then you're not going to discover that. The problem is, okay, there's lots of clusters of longevity, but is it a common gene in all these families? Probably not. And if it's not, well, if it's a different gene that confers longevity to a family in Sicily, and well, maybe a different gene in another family in Sicily, but then you have a different gene in a family in Hawaii, then that's going to be very difficult to detect with the tools we have now. So those are the problems we have to identify. Having said that, it's something I'm very interested in. It's a big focus of the field, is understanding the underlying factors determining why let's call them cases of exceptional longevity.
I'm wondering when I started, since I started to work on aging, how much would be important to studying this phenomenon from a different point of view at the same time, to promote more and more the interdisciplinary research. At the institute where I'm working now, my professor Sarah Harper and George Leeson, they are trying to build a platform in which they are bringing together different professors from different fields.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this could be in some way a secret also to understand better what aging is, because we can then understand a little more what it does mean from a sociological point of view, for epidemiological point of view, from other science. What do you think about it?
Yes, absolutely. I think we need a multidisciplinary approach to tackle aging, and we need to understand the various factors behind. Well, let's take about centenarians as an example. I think that, well, there's evidence there's genetic factors associated with longevity of centenarians, but there's also lifestyle factors. There's also social factors. So we need to understand those as a whole, to understand the underlying causative processes that then make some people live longer than others. So yes, absolutely. I mean, I guess my work is focused more on biology and genetics, and biological mechanisms. Also because I think those are, from an intervention perspective, they have a greater impact. But the way I also see in terms of us tackling the problem of aging is, okay, so first of all, we need to address issues like lifestyle. And the fact remains, people still smoke. It's bad for them, but people still smoke. People are still very obese. So there are factors, lifestyle factors, that can be addressed. And I think that's what we can try to do now. And then I think in the near future, we'll have pharmacological approaches, longevity drugs, and so on. And then on a third stage, more futuristic, we'll have things like gene therapy and tissue regeneration and rejuvenative approaches that will allow us to more radically intervene in aging. But on a first stage, we have to go with the lifestyle choices. Yes.
And probably for this one, it would be also more and more interesting having data set in which we could collect information also from different disciplines. I know that there are some of them already there, but none of them are really available to everybody.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we do maintain database for some aspect like genetics and pharmacological approaches to aging. I mean, one of the things we've been working, although it's not online yet, is we're working on a website of different factors associated with longevity. You know, which you know, things like diet, well, lifestyle choices, and so on. So that's something we're working on as well. So, but absolutely, I mean, I'm a big advocate of open science and open access to data and methods, and so I certainly think we should make as much data available out there for others, researchers, and the public in general to use.
The last few questions that I want to talk about is dealing with public healthcare and is dealing with the impact of that in society. If aging, as we have been discussing, biological aging, can actually improve the quality of human life and the quantity of human life, why isn't every biological researcher, I mean, you and I are both from the biology side, and Sara is from the sociology side, why aren't we all just working on tackling aging rather than heart disease or diabetes and cardiovascular disease? And we will come to this in just a bit, but infectious disease and all of those things, because it seems that aging is the underlying cause, or at least protective against many things.
Well, I think, well, that's a good question. I mean, I think that's to do more with societal perspectives on aging. Most people think aging that is a natural process. I mean, lots of people, you know, ask me, why do you work on aging? I mean, what's the point? It's a natural process. So I think there's an issue of perceptions we have in the field of aging. People don't see it. I think it's a question of fairness. If you have, I mean, there's fascinating data on what people donate money to in terms of charities related to diseases, and it tends to be charities that do things people consider as unfair. You know, childhood cancer would be a perfect example because it's perceived as unfair. If you're a child and you have cancer, that's very unfair, so we should give money to that. On the other hand, cardiovascular diseases don't tend to get as much money, even though they're the major killers in our societies. They don't get as much money. Why? Because I think there's this social perception that if people have cardiovascular diseases, it's their fault. They're obese, they don't eat healthy, they don't exercise, they smoke, and so on. So it's quite interesting what people give money to. And I think aging is reflected in that, is that people see, all right, people aged, well, that's fair. It happens to everybody as long as you live long enough. So we shouldn't do anything about it. So in that context, I think what we need to do as a field is show, yes, everybody ages, but you know, aging is ultimately a driver of diseases. And what we're trying to do is make people not develop diseases, because nobody wants to get sick. So we want to prevent people from being sick. We want to make people more resistant to diseases by slowing down aging, and that's the argument we have to make. Because I think at the moment most people don't see aging as a problem that needs to be addressed, in fact, and that's why most biologists don't. I mean, as someone who teaches at university, I mean, lots of my students are interested in cancer. So cancer is certainly the major, you know, the number one thing students are interested in tackling. Why? Because it's perceived as unfair. If you have cancer, that's unfair. And so you want to tackle it. Aging is not perceived as unfair. And I think that's an issue of perspective that we need to change as a field, hence the focus on health, on disease prevention, as opposed to just extending lifespan.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Sara here wrote an article, a blog post in the Institute of Aging's blog about the uncertainty of the data. We have to face the elephant in the room. It's the 10th of April, 2020. So we are all under, we're all sticking to our homes as much as we can because of the spread of COVID-19. And Sara's article about COVID-19 was the uncertainty of the data and the importance of the mild and asymptomatic case, in which Sara pointed out that the biggest probability or the biggest indicator or predictors of mortality from COVID-19 is your age. So the methods that you are pioneering, the databases that your team is putting together, the papers that you have discussed that both you and your colleagues have published, if and when they come into reality and take shape in forms of drugs and treatments, and they tackle biological underlying aging, are we also saying that the populace would be also more protected as we see in the COVID-19 data, from infectious diseases as well?
If we could slow down the process of aging, then yes, absolutely. We know that immunosenescence, the degeneration of the immune system, is a major aspect of the process of aging. So if we could slow that down, then that would have some protection at the level of infectious diseases. And we know that older people, obviously, not just COVID-19, but the common flu, pneumonia, lots of infections, they are much more susceptible to infectious diseases as you grow older. So if we can slow down this process of aging, that would have an impact on infectious diseases as well. Absolutely. In fact, it will be, I think, quite interesting to see whether, given the impact of COVID-19 now, it would be interesting to see, are individuals, as a follow-up epidemiological study. I mean, yes, age is a risk factor, but what other risk factors are associated with COVID-19? We know poor health is associated with it. So, well, do people who take metformin already, are they somewhat protected from COVID-19, for instance, compared to individuals of the same age? I mean, I think that would be quite interesting to find out. I think some of my colleagues working on aging have advocated that rapamycin would, and maybe even metformin, would offer some protection from COVID-19 because it slows down aging. I mean, the short answer is I don't know, but rapamycin, low-dose rapamycin, for example, has benefits in terms of immunosenescence. So perhaps it would offer some protection. So although we don't have an answer to these questions yet, absolutely, for diseases like COVID-19 that are specifically focused on older individuals, if we could slow down aging, then that would have a very positive impact on these infectious diseases as well. I actually, one thing I just point out, because I was talking to some colleagues yesterday about this, what I actually think is interesting about COVID-19 is not the fact that it mostly targets old individuals, because that's quite normal for infectious diseases. Is the fact that it doesn't seem to affect, or well, I wouldn't say it doesn't affect, but children seem to be protected from it compared to others. Now, the traditional flu, the common flu, tends to affect children as well, particularly young children. So why are they protected from COVID-19? I actually think it's quite interesting. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's interesting why that is. Why is just so specifically older individuals that are being affected?
That is an interesting question. I'm not sure if Sara, the interviewer, becomes the interviewee, because you have been looking at the data from Italy, especially. Yeah. If you see that it's because of the paucity of data from children, or is it actually a phenomenon that is actually happening? Because you pointed out the difference in data from different countries and who is being tested, and also the point of the people who are asymptomatic completely.
Yes, this was, I think, one of the biggest point of what I understood reading the different reports and seeing different data, even though I said, and I wrote hopefully enough clearly also in my blog, that I think we need more data and more time to understand this data better. But what it seems, in particular, if we compare different countries, like I did in the blog Korea and in Italy, it seems that this virus attack all the population. The only point is that in some countries where they tested more people, like in South Korea, we could clearly understand that many of them, in the youngest group, they had the virus, but they were asymptomatic. something that we cannot see in other countries like in Italy. And this is because in Italy, as well as in other countries in Europe, they are not testing everybody, but they are testing in particular people when they start to have severe symptoms. So I think at this point, the information that we have from data are for sure important, but we have to still understand them better. And maybe one of the strategies could be also to do more and more tests to all the population.
Mm-hmm.
And something else that I found very interesting discussing with other colleagues when I was studying also this COVID-19 is also how the different countries use the language to explain this COVID-19, and in particular when they are talking about mortality rate. Because in some countries, in some reports, like here in the UK, for example, they really say that people are dying and they are positive to COVID-19, but they don't link the COVID-19 directly to the death. So they highlight that they could have other symptoms, also these people in particular, if they are old. In other countries instead, and in other reports that we can see from the government, it's a little more the two aspects, so COVID-19 and the death of people are much more linked, much more strong. It seems that these people are dying just because of this virus, and sometimes they even didn't mention the other symptoms that these people might have.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I think, is sometimes a matter of also how to give some information.
Yes, no, so that I mean that's very interesting, and yes, absolutely. I mean, as you know, here in the UK, you don't get tested unless you go to hospital. So I mean, I do think children can get COVID-19. They just seem to have much milder symptoms. That's the point. So that's why they exhibit, compared to older individuals, they exhibit resistance to it. I mean, I know there are some children who have died of COVID-19 or with COVID-19 again, but the incidence of hospitalizations of children from COVID-19 seems to be much, much, much lower than of older individuals. And when we have seasonal flu, that's not the case. You do see it's like a U-shaped curve. You have young people, children, particularly young children, develop the flu and serious symptoms, and you have old people. And COVID-19, no, it's just increasing. That's what I think is quite intriguing. And I mean, other than immunosenescence, I don't have an answer to it. But of course, children, the reason normally they develop the flu is because their immune system is not completely developed yet. But yet, that seems to be sufficient for, in the vast majority of cases, to cope with COVID-19. And even if they get infected, they have relatively mild symptoms. In fact, in many cases, I saw some data from China, so that quite a lot of children had at a molecular level signs of COVID-19, but they were asymptomatic. So quite a lot of children, they don't even have any symptoms of it, which I think is quite interesting. And I don't have an answer why that is, but I think it's something that from a biological perspective is quite interesting.
That is really fascinating, and I hope. I mean, it's extremely sad that people are dying, but I hope that we learn something from this in the future. It seems to me that biological aging, or reducing biological aging, or tackling biological aging, would be, on the whole, beneficial towards alleviating suffering from old age and postponing diseases of old age. Mm-hmm. If that is the case, and this is definitely a question that I can ask you, because you, unlike many other scientists, are actually a broad thinker, besides being a musician and a poet and a transhumanist and many other things. Why is it that, although it is so beneficial to tackle aging, and you have pointed out in one of your previous answers the just versus unjustness of certain diseases, why is it, do you think, that in stories that we tell each other, from folklore to legends to fairy tales, it is always the villain, or it's negative to go after the search for immortality? Also, in places in popular philosophical shows like The Good Place, it is seen that it is seen as immortality or immortality is almost suffering in itself. Why is it that these tropes are constantly repeated, not just during our generation, but through generations, through stories that we tell?
That's an interesting question. I guess some people perceive it as selfish, that you want to become immortal when everyone else is mortal. I think that would be maybe one of the reasons. I don't know if there's some again some aspects of justice to it. Okay, aging affects everyone, so it's quite fair. And so if you don't want to age, then that is unfair and maybe even arrogant of you to think that way. So I mean, I certainly in my talks I've had people say that they think trying to be immortal or try to live longer is selfish, it's arrogant. So I think there's still, from a cultural perspective, I think there's still a lot we need to do to convince society that this is worthwhile. I mean, having said that, I think there's another side to it, which is the fact that governments, including the UK, including the European Union, including they recognize aging as a major problem, and they want to tackle it. Now, they never say they want to, make people immortal, but they want to. There's a lot of investment in the field of aging, not necessarily on the biology of aging. The United States had invested a lot in Alzheimer's disease and neurodegenerative diseases. So there's a focus on that, not on aging as a problem, but on age-related diseases. So at least from that perspective, there has been some recognition by governments that population aging is a problem, and we need to address it socially, medically, from a research perspective as well. And I think that's beneficial. And I think as a field in terms of aging, again, we just need to try to do what I said earlier, try to convince what we're trying to do is not make people immortal. And that's a word I avoid using in my talks and presentations and papers. I avoid use the word immortality, again, because I do think it has, at least with some people, a negative connotation, and focus on health. We want to make people healthier for longer. It's very difficult to argue against that.
Well, I found very fascinating all what you describe, and I think aging is a super interesting phenomena and super complex as well. So I think we really need a lot of research on it, really trying to understand all the aspects that are still unclear. But I don't know, it might be a little tricky question, but if you needed to suggest something to the government nowadays to tackle aging, what would you say? So maybe the most important things that we have to do now without waiting anymore.
Well, I think there has to be, I think there's already at the government level, there's a realization that aging is an important problem. I mean, certainly as a biologist, I have to be somewhat biased and say, well, we have aging as a problem, but not so much on the biology aspect. And certainly in the UK, that's not the case. So aging is a problem, but it's more at the level of aging diseases. That's the focus. So I think focusing on understanding the biology of aging and focusing on understanding how, we can go from manipulate aging in animals, which you can do. You can manipulate aging in animals. You can make them live longer. You can make them healthier for longer. How we can translate that to human beings. And that should be a major focus of research. Unfortunately, companies are realizing that already. There's this big growth in companies focusing on aging. We know with Google, with Jeff Bezos investing in it as well. So there's a big growth from an industrial commercial perspective that has not been accompanied yet by governments. So I think that's what would be necessary, is really tackle this problem by going at the core of the problem, which is the aging process and how we can slow it down in human beings.
For a takeaway point from today's meeting and from all of the things that you have learned, and I think you have expressed already in some of the previous questions, what does a person do today who are in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, in order to try to see the future where they can be a 100-year-old or a 150-year-old? Do you have any tangible takeaway advice, or also any musings on the future that is to come for people today?
I mean, personally, I mean, I've been wondering about that for quite a long time, ever since I was in my 20s. And I mean, I still think that following those lifestyle advice that your mother would tell you is what I try to do. You know, I try to exercise. Even now with lockdown, I'm going to go out later today, go for a run or at least a walk. Don't eat too much fatty foods, too much sugar. Don't smoke. Don't drink too much alcohol. You know, follow those basic advice any doctor will give you. So that's what I try to do. I mean, I think there's also, I would say there's also a balance. I mean, you also want to enjoy some things, you know, so you want to live a life where you have some pleasures, and at the same time you optimize your health for longer. And that's what I try to do. I am optimistic about longevity drugs, so I think this will come about in the near future. You know, next 10 years, I think we'll have longevity drugs. I don't take any particular drug at the moment. I don't, because I think, you know, you need to have solid evidence, I think, to take something. That, you know, if you're talking about taking a drug for years, maybe even decades, I think you need to have good evidence for it. So I still think we need to wait for more solid data on that. But I am optimistic that this will occur. You know, and some of my colleagues would argue we already have longevity drugs. You know, metformin is a longevity drug. People should take it. I don't take metformin, but I know people who do. So I think that more evidence will come about concerning these longevity drugs that I think will allow people now to have a higher chance of living to be 100. Absolutely. And when you're thinking further ahead, you know, 30, 50 years ahead, then yeah, maybe we will have things like rejuvenation therapies and gene therapies that will allow us to really have a big impact on aging. I'm not sure about that. I think, you know, rejuvenation is a very strong word, and it's we can't do it in animals, so will we be able to do it in human beings in 50 years even? I'm not sure about that, but we never know. I think for now, just try to stay safe and try to stay healthy, and wash your hands.
Thank you, Joao. That is excellent. You gave us lots of points to think about and lots of topics for discussion next time when we chat with you and with other researchers. So that was fantastic. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. And I hope you and your family are going to be safe. And certainly echo the advice of washing the hands. So thank you. Thank you so much.